Sometimes the moment that changes your life is not loud at all. Sometimes it is a quiet promise that refuses to leave. A light spring rain had just begun to fall when Ethan Carter stepped out of St. Matthew Medical Center with a folded discharge packet tucked beneath his arm. The appointment had been routine, but his doctor had ended it with words that echoed louder than any business meeting Ethan had attended that year. "Your heart is healthy enough to keep working," the physician had said with a gentle smile. "But your life is not healthy enough to keep living this way." Ethan had laughed politely at the time, promising to slow down, knowing full well that another packed calendar waited for him on Monday morning. As one of the youngest millionaire chief executive officers in Chicago, every hour of his day already belonged to someone else. Investors expected him. Employees depended on him. His phone vibrated every few seconds with messages marked urgent. Yet as he crossed the hospital parking lot beneath the soft gray sky, none of those notifications caught his attention. Something else did. Near the far corner of the parking garage sat an aging silver sedan that looked strangely out of place among polished luxury vehicles. Its engine was off. Its headlights were dark. Raindrops slowly traced the windshield. Behind the steering wheel sat a little blonde girl no older than 7. Her small hands rested carefully at the very top of the wheel, exactly where an experienced driver might place them. She was not pretending to drive. She was simply sitting perfectly still, looking through the rain-covered windshield as though she were waiting for someone who had promised to return. Ethan slowed his steps. At first he assumed a parent had stepped away for only a moment, but after quietly observing for nearly a minute, he realized no adult approached the car. The little girl did not touch the keys. She did not reach for any controls. She simply remained there, blinking away quiet tears while whispering words he could barely hear through the rain. Concern replaced curiosity. Ethan walked toward the sedan slowly, making sure not to frighten her. When he reached the driver's side window, he gently tapped the glass with one finger. The little girl turned immediately. Her bright blue eyes widened with surprise before she carefully lowered the window just a few inches. "Hi," Ethan said softly, offering the warmest smile he could manage. "Are you waiting for someone?" The little girl nodded. "Yes." Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of someone trying very hard to be brave. Ethan glanced around the nearly empty parking lot once more before asking, "Is your family nearby?" She looked forward again, her fingers tightening slightly around the steering wheel. "My dad told me to wait right here." Ethan noticed there were no keys in the ignition. The car had never been started. Relief washed over him, but concern remained. "Did he tell you when he would come back?" The little girl swallowed quietly before answering. "He said he had to go somewhere first." Ethan hesitated, sensing there was far more to the story than the simple words she had chosen. Rain continued falling gently across the windshield, blurring the world outside into soft streaks of gray. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, the little girl looked back at him with an expression far older than her years and whispered, "I promised Dad I would keep his seat warm until he came back." Something inside Ethan shifted so suddenly that even the constant buzzing of his phone disappeared from his thoughts. Standing alone beside an old sedan in the hospital parking lot, he realized this was no ordinary misunderstanding. Whatever promise this little girl was protecting had become more important than every meeting waiting on his calendar, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he knew he could not simply walk away. Ethan remained beside the open window for another quiet moment, careful not to let his concern become pressure. The little girl still held the steering wheel gently, as though letting go would somehow break the promise she had made. "My name is Ethan," he said softly. "What is yours?" She looked at him for a second before answering. "Grace." He smiled warmly. "That is a beautiful name." Grace returned a tiny smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it had arrived. Rain continued tapping softly against the roof of the old sedan while the hospital parking lot slowly emptied around them. A nurse walked toward her own car several rows away. A family loaded suitcases into the trunk of an SUV, and an ambulance quietly departed from the emergency entrance. Life continued moving forward, but inside the silver sedan time seemed to have stopped. Ethan noticed a folded children's blanket resting neatly on the back seat beside a small backpack and an old stuffed rabbit whose fur had faded with years of love. Everything inside the car looked carefully organized, as though someone had always taken pride in keeping it ready for another family trip. Has your dad been inside the hospital today? Ethan asked gently. Grace nodded. They moved him this morning. Ethan frowned slightly. Moved him where? Grace looked down at the steering wheel before answering. The nice nurse said he had to go somewhere that helps people get stronger. Ethan immediately understood that she was talking about a rehabilitation center. He felt relieved that her father was receiving continued care, yet another question quietly appeared. Did someone come with you today? Grace nodded again. Miss Karen did. Where is Miss Karen now? Grace pointed toward the hospital entrance. She is filling out papers. She told me I could wait here because Dad wanted me to remember this seat. Ethan slowly exhaled, feeling much calmer now that he knew another responsible adult was nearby. He glanced toward the main entrance just as a hospital staff member walked outside carrying a stack of folders, followed by a woman in her early 50s wearing a volunteer badge. The woman looked around the parking lot before smiling with relief as she spotted Grace. She approached at an unhurried pace. There you are, sweetheart, she called kindly. I thought you might still be here. Grace looked toward Ethan before quietly saying, This is Mr. Ethan. He was making sure I was okay. The volunteer smiled appreciatively. Thank you for checking on her. I am Karen Mitchell. I help families during long-term care transitions. Ethan shook her hand before briefly explaining what had happened. Karen's expression softened. Grace's father asked if she could spend one last minute in the driver's seat before he left this morning. She explained quietly. Every summer they used to take road trips together. He always told her adventures began the moment they closed these doors. Ethan glanced back at Grace, whose fingers still rested gently on the steering wheel. Karen continued. When the rehabilitation transport arrived, he looked at Grace and said, Keep my seat warm until we can take another drive together. She has been honoring that promise ever since. Ethan looked through the rain-speckled windshield, imagining countless family road trips filled with music, laughter, and ordinary conversations that children remember forever. Suddenly, the old sedan no longer looked worn. It looked treasured. Grace carefully turned toward Ethan again and asked in a small voice, Do you think promises stay warm if you keep them long enough? Ethan felt the question settle deep inside his heart. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed again with another urgent business call. He looked down at the glowing screen, then quietly pressed the side button to silence it. Returning his attention entirely to Grace, he smiled gently and said, I think the best promises never lose their warmth. I think they wait patiently until the people who made them can find each other again. Grace smiled a little wider this time, and for the first time since Ethan had entered the parking lot, he realized he was no longer thinking about the meeting he was already missing. He was thinking about a promise that somehow felt important enough to change both of their lives. The rain finally faded into a soft mist as Karen locked the sedan and invited Grace back inside the hospital to collect the last of her father's belongings. Ethan should have walked toward his own car. His driver had already called twice, and his assistant had left 3 messages reminding him that an important investor meeting had been moved forward by an hour. Instead, he found himself quietly following Karen and Grace through the wide hospital corridors without fully understanding why. Perhaps it was the doctor's warning from earlier that morning. Perhaps it was the little girl's promise. Or perhaps it was simply because, for the first time in years, something mattered more than another meeting. Karen led them into a quiet family waiting room where a small cardboard box rested on a table beside a window overlooking the parking lot. Grace walked directly to it with careful hands, as though every item inside deserved to be touched with respect. She lifted a faded baseball cap first and smiled softly before placing it beside her backpack. Next came an old travel mug decorated with tiny mountain stickers collected from family vacations. Ethan watched silently as each ordinary object somehow carried extraordinary meaning. Finally, Grace reached the bottom of the box and removed a folded road map that had clearly been opened and closed hundreds of times. Its edges were worn, colorful ink circles covered different states, and handwritten notes filled the margins. She gently unfolded it across the table. Dad always said every trip needed a map, even if we already knew where we were going, she whispered. Ethan stepped closer without speaking. Karen smiled kindly. They spent almost every summer exploring little towns across Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Nothing fancy. They just liked discovering places together. Grace traced one of the blue circles with her finger. This was where we found the pie shop that let me ring the bell after every customer. She moved to another mark farther north. That lake was where Dad taught me how to skip stones. Every destination came with a memory instead of a tourist attraction. Ethan realized the map was less about roads than about moments. As Grace carefully folded it again, something small slipped from between the layers and landed softly on the table. It was an old brass key attached to a leather tag that simply read, "For the last adventure." Grace picked it up curiously. "I have never seen this before." Karen looked equally surprised. "Neither have I." Ethan studied the small key for a moment before handing it back to Grace. "Maybe your father wanted you to find it when the time was right." Grace turned the key over in her hand, noticing tiny scratches from years of careful use. "Do you think it opens something important?" she asked. Ethan smiled gently. "The people who leave behind keys usually hope someone will discover a story." Grace carefully slipped the brass key into the small front pocket of her backpack before folding the map once more. Beneath the map lay a weathered leather journal secured with an elastic band. She looked toward Karen for permission before opening it. The first page carried neat handwriting in blue ink. At the very top were the words, "Every mile matters because every memory does." Grace smiled through quiet tears. "That is Dad's writing." She closed the journal again instead of reading further. "I think I want to save it." Ethan nodded with understanding. Some stories deserve to be opened slowly. Karen checked her watch before kneeling beside Grace. "The rehabilitation center allows visitors on Saturday afternoons," she said warmly. "Your father would love to see you." Grace smiled for the first time since leaving the parking lot. As Ethan quietly prepared to leave, Grace looked up at him and asked one simple question. "Would you like to hear about the places on the map next Saturday?" Ethan looked at the folded road map, then at the little brass key resting safely inside her backpack. Without checking his calendar, he answered immediately. "I would not miss it for anything." Somewhere inside that worn map and mysterious key, a new journey had already begun, even though none of them yet knew where it would lead. The following Saturday arrived with bright sunshine replacing the gray skies that had surrounded the hospital only a week earlier. Ethan surprised even himself by canceling an executive brunch that had been scheduled months in advance. When Claire asked whether something important had come up, he smiled and answered with complete honesty. "Yes, a promise." 30 minutes later, he parked beside the same aging silver sedan, which now rested quietly in the rehabilitation center parking lot beneath a row of blooming maple trees. Grace was already sitting behind the steering wheel exactly as she had before, except this time she was smiling when she saw him approach. She carefully opened the driver's side door before he reached the car. "You came," she said happily. Ethan laughed softly. "I told you I would." Grace patted the passenger seat. "Dad always said adventures are better when nobody rides alone." Ethan paused for a brief moment before opening the passenger door and settling into the worn fabric seat. The sedan remained completely silent. The keys were still nowhere near the ignition. Through the windshield, they could see families arriving to visit loved ones inside the rehabilitation center while spring sunlight reflected gently across the glass. Neither of them felt the need to hurry anywhere. Grace carefully unfolded the old road map across both of their laps. Colorful circles covered dozens of small towns. Beside many of them, her father had written short notes in neat blue handwriting. Grace pointed toward one circle near Lake Geneva. "This was where we ate pancakes that were bigger than my face." Ethan smiled. "Did you finish them?" Grace giggled. "Not even close. Dad helped." She moved her finger farther north. "This was where we watched fireflies until it got dark." Another circle carried only 3 handwritten words. "Best sunset ever." Ethan quietly imagined the father and daughter sitting beside a peaceful lake, saying almost nothing because the moment itself had already said enough. He wrote memories instead of directions, Ethan observed. Grace nodded proudly. Dad said maps should remind people where happiness happened. They continued exploring every handwritten note until Grace reached the folded back corner of the map, where a tiny envelope had been carefully taped years earlier. She looked surprised. "I never noticed this." Ethan watched quietly as she peeled the envelope free without tearing the fragile paper. Inside rested a single folded note written in the same familiar handwriting. Grace unfolded it carefully and read aloud. "If you are reading this, it means you remembered to keep looking instead of giving up." She smiled before continuing. Every great adventure begins by opening one more thing than you expected. Grace looked immediately toward the little brass key inside the front pocket of her backpack. Ethan noticed the same realization crossing her face. "Do you think Dad meant the key?" he asked gently. Grace slowly removed it and placed it beside the map. The worn brass surface caught the afternoon sunlight for just a moment before she whispered, "Maybe." Ethan turned the key over thoughtfully, but resisted the temptation to search the car immediately. Instead, he looked toward Grace. "Some adventures become even better when we solve them together." Grace nodded enthusiastically before placing both the key and the note back into her backpack with great care. They spent another hour reading more pages from the travel journal, laughing at stories about wrong turns that led to tiny bakeries, surprise picnics beside quiet rivers, and rainy afternoons spent singing inside the parked sedan until the weather cleared. As Ethan listened, he realized the old car had never been the most valuable part of those trips. It had simply been the place where love traveled. Before leaving, Grace gently rested one hand on the dashboard and smiled toward the empty driver's seat. "I think Dad would like you sitting over there," she said. Ethan looked through the windshield before answering quietly. "Then next Saturday, we will keep discovering where his map wants to take us." Neither of them noticed that beneath the trunk floor of the old sedan, patiently hidden for years, the little brass key was already waiting for the day it would finally reveal the last adventure. The Saturdays slowly became something both Ethan and Grace quietly protected. No contracts were signed on those afternoons. No investor meetings were accepted. Ethan's executive calendar remained completely empty from noon until sunset, and before long Claire stopped asking why. She simply smiled whenever she noticed another Saturday blocked with the single word, adventure. Grace looked forward to those afternoons with the same excitement she once reserved for family road trips. Although the silver sedan never left its parking space outside the rehabilitation center, the two of them somehow traveled farther each week without turning the key. They climbed inside, unfolded the old map across the dashboard, and let Grace's father's journal guide them through memories that still felt wonderfully alive. One Saturday, the journal described a tiny bakery famous for cinnamon rolls nearly the size of dinner plates. Grace laughed while reading the entry aloud. "Dad wrote that we got lost for 45 minutes before finding it, but he said getting lost was part of the recipe." Ethan smiled. "Your father sounds like someone who collected stories instead of schedules." Grace nodded proudly. "He always said arriving together mattered more than arriving on time." Ethan quietly looked through the windshield at families coming and going from the rehabilitation center. Those simple words lingered in his thoughts far longer than he expected. They reminded him of the doctor's warning about slowing down and of the countless moments he had sacrificed in pursuit of perfect schedules. Another weekend, they discovered an entry describing a small lake where father and daughter had watched shooting stars while wrapped in the faded blanket that still rested neatly across the back seat. Grace carefully unfolded the blanket and spread it over both of their laps as they continued reading. "It still smells like the car," she whispered with a gentle smile. Ethan nodded. Some memories know exactly where they belong. Grace reached into her backpack and removed the little brass key before placing it beside the journal. "I wonder if it gets lonely waiting," she said thoughtfully. Ethan picked up the key and turned it slowly between his fingers. Tiny scratches covered its surface, suggesting years of careful use. "Maybe it is not waiting," he replied. "Maybe it is being patient." Grace considered his answer before carefully placing the key back beside the folded map. After visiting her father inside the rehabilitation center each week, she always returned with one new story to add to the journal's growing collection. Sometimes they wrote together on blank pages near the back. Ethan described the afternoon they shared hot chocolate while spring rain tapped gently against the windshield. Grace drew a small picture of the old sedan beneath a rainbow. Another page held a pressed maple leaf collected from the parking lot where they first met. Without realizing it, they had begun continuing the journal instead of simply reading it. Karen noticed the changes almost immediately. One afternoon, she smiled as Ethan and Grace climbed out of the parked sedan carrying notebooks, colored pencils, and the familiar road map. "You two never seem disappointed that the car never goes anywhere," she observed. Grace grinned brightly. "It goes everywhere." Ethan laughed softly. "We simply travel differently." Karen looked toward the old sedan with quiet understanding. I think that is exactly what her father hoped would happen. Before heading home that evening, Ethan helped Grace carefully return every treasure to its proper place. The blanket was folded neatly across the back seat. The journal rested inside the glove compartment beside the weathered road map. The little brass key remained safely inside Grace's backpack because neither of them yet knew where it belonged. As Ethan gently closed the passenger door, he noticed something almost invisible beneath the trunk carpet through the slightly open cargo area. It was only the corner of a narrow metal panel, hidden so well that no one would have noticed without looking carefully. Ethan said nothing. Instead, he smiled quietly to himself. Some discoveries deserve the right moment, and deep inside he felt that the little brass key had not finished telling its story. By the time early summer arrived, Ethan no longer measured his weeks by quarterly reports or shareholder presentations. He measured them by Saturdays. Every visit to the rehabilitation center had quietly become part of a life he had never expected to value more than business success. Grace always met him beside the familiar silver sedan with the same bright smile, the same blue ribbon in her hair, and the same excitement to discover another page of her father's journal. The old car had become their little library, their memory room, and their classroom all at once. One warm Saturday afternoon, after visiting her father inside the rehabilitation center, Grace climbed into the driver's seat carrying a folded piece of paper. She looked unusually thoughtful. Ethan settled into the passenger seat and noticed she was tracing tiny circles across the paper with her finger. "Dad asked me to draw our next road trip," she said softly. Ethan smiled. "Did you?" Grace nodded before handing him the page. It showed the silver sedan driving through mountains, forests, and little towns. In the front seat sat her father. In the back seat sat Grace reading her journal. Beside the car, she had carefully drawn another person wearing a charcoal jacket. Ethan looked at the picture for a long moment before asking quietly, "Who is standing outside the car?" Grace looked surprised by the question. "That is you." Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest. "Why am I outside?" Grace smiled with complete innocence. "Because Dad says every good traveler starts as someone who helps before someone who rides along." Ethan laughed softly. "Your father is a very wise man." Grace folded the drawing carefully before placing it inside the journal between two completed pages. "He also said journeys can grow. Sometimes new people become part of the map." Those simple words stayed with Ethan long after they left the sedan. Later that afternoon, Karen found Ethan standing quietly beside the parking lot watching the evening sunlight reflect across the old car's hood. "You have changed," she said with a gentle smile. Ethan looked at her curiously. "Have I?" Karen nodded. "The first day you came here, you checked your phone every few minutes. Today I watched you leave it inside your jacket for almost 5 hours." Ethan laughed quietly. "I suppose I forgot about it." Karen smiled knowingly. "No, I think you finally remembered something more important." Before leaving, Ethan walked around the back of the sedan once again. His attention returned to the small corner of metal hidden beneath the trunk carpet. This time he gently lifted the edge just enough to confirm what he had suspected weeks earlier. Beneath the removable panel sat a tiny brass keyhole almost perfectly matched to the old key Grace carried every Saturday. He carefully lowered the carpet again without opening anything. The discovery belonged to Grace, not to him. Some surprises became even more meaningful when shared at exactly the right moment. As he closed the trunk, Grace appeared beside him carrying 2 cups of lemonade from the Rehabilitation Center cafe. "What are you smiling about?" she asked. Ethan accepted 1 cup and looked toward the quiet sedan glowing beneath the golden evening sun. "I think your father was planning one more adventure than either of us realized." Grace tilted her head curiously but did not ask another question. Instead, she simply smiled, trusting that some stories unfolded better one page at a time. Together they sat on a nearby bench sipping lemonade while watching families arrive for evening visits. Ethan no longer saw the rehabilitation center as a place defined by uncertainty. Because of Grace and her father, it had become a place where promises were kept, memories continued growing, and hope quietly waited behind ordinary doors. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees, Ethan knew that the little brass key had almost reached the moment for which it had patiently waited, and deep inside, he sensed that whatever it unlocked would not simply reveal another object. It would reveal the final gift a loving father had prepared long before any of them understood how their lives would become forever connected. Late August arrived with cooler mornings and longer shadows stretching across the rehabilitation center parking lot. The familiar silver sedan remained parked beneath the maple trees, but this Saturday something felt different the moment Ethan stepped out of his car. Grace did not run to greet him as she always did. Instead, she sat quietly on the front steps beside Karen, holding the old road map tightly against her chest. Her smile appeared only after she saw Ethan, yet it carried a sadness that immediately caught his attention. "Good morning," Ethan said gently as he joined them. Grace stood and hugged him without saying a word. Karen exchanged a quiet glance with Ethan before speaking softly. "We received an update yesterday." Ethan's expression became serious. "Is everything all right?" Karen nodded reassuringly. "Yes, there is good news, but it comes with a difficult decision." Grace looked down at the folded map in her hands. "Dad is getting stronger," she whispered. "The doctors are very happy with his progress." Ethan smiled immediately. "That is wonderful." Grace nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the pavement. "They also said he may need to move to a specialized rehabilitation program almost 300 miles away so he can continue improving." The words settled quietly between them. Ethan immediately understood what that distance meant. Their Saturday afternoons inside the old sedan could soon become impossible. Grace looked toward the silver car parked nearby. "If Dad goes there, the car cannot stay here anymore." Karen continued gently. "His brother has offered to sell it and use the money for future transportation after rehabilitation." Grace closed her eyes for a moment, as though trying to hold on to every memory connected to the old sedan. "But this is where all our adventures still live," she whispered. Ethan looked toward the familiar car, remembering every page of the journal, every laugh over forgotten road trips, every quiet afternoon spent reading together without ever turning the ignition. The sedan had become far more than an old vehicle. It had become the place where a lonely businessman learned how to slow down and where a little girl learned that promises could grow instead of disappear. After visiting Grace's father that afternoon, the three of them returned to the parking lot one more time. Grace carefully placed the journal inside the glove compartment, folded the blanket across the back seat, and rested her hand on the dashboard exactly as she had done every Saturday. "I wish cars could remember people forever," she said softly. Ethan smiled kindly. "I think some do." Grace turned toward him. "How?" Ethan gently tapped the journal resting inside the glove compartment. "Because every memory you wrote inside happened here first." Grace thought about his answer before slowly reaching into her backpack. She removed the little brass key and held it tightly in her hand. "Maybe Dad wanted me to find whatever this opens before the car leaves." Ethan looked toward the trunk for only a brief second. Before meeting Grace's eyes again, he knew exactly where the hidden keyhole waited beneath the carpet, but this moment belonged entirely to her. "Then next Saturday," he said quietly, "we will discover it together." Grace smiled for the first time that day. It was not a large smile, but it carried hope once again. As the evening sun painted the silver sedan with warm golden light, Ethan realized that every meaningful journey eventually reached a crossroads. Some roads invited people to keep driving forward. Others asked them to stop long enough to understand why the journey had mattered in the first place. Standing beside Grace and the old sedan, he silently hoped that whatever waited behind the hidden compartment would give them both the courage to embrace whatever came next, because deep inside he knew the final adventure her father had prepared was finally ready to begin. The following Saturday arrived beneath a clear September sky that made every color seem brighter than usual. Golden leaves drifted gently across the rehabilitation center parking lot as Ethan walked toward the familiar silver sedan carrying 2 cups of hot apple cider. Grace was already waiting beside the car, her backpack resting at her feet and the little brass key carefully wrapped inside a blue handkerchief. She smiled as Ethan approached, but both of them understood that this afternoon felt different from all the others. It carried the quiet anticipation of a page that had been waiting to be turned for a very long time. After visiting her father together, they returned to the sedan one last time before his transfer to the new rehabilitation program. Grace climbed into the driver's seat, while Ethan opened the trunk exactly as he had planned. He carefully lifted the carpet near the rear corner and revealed the small brass keyhole hidden beneath the removable metal panel. Grace slowly stepped closer, her eyes widening with amazement. "Dad really hid something," she whispered. Ethan smiled gently. "I think he trusted you to find it when you were ready." Grace unwrapped the little brass key with trembling fingers before kneeling beside the trunk. For a brief moment, she simply looked at it, remembering every Saturday they had spent wondering about its purpose. Then, taking a slow breath, she carefully inserted the key into the waiting lock. It turned smoothly with a soft click. Together, they lifted the hidden panel and discovered a handcrafted wooden box resting inside a protected compartment. Grace carefully carried it to the back seat before opening the lid. Inside lay dozens of neatly organized treasures. There were postcards from every family road trip they had ever taken, each one covered with handwritten memories. There were small polished stones collected beside lakes and rivers, pressed wildflowers, ticket stubs from county fairs, photographs filled with smiling faces, and a bundle of carefully tied envelopes marked with different birthdays still waiting in Grace's future. Resting on top of everything else was one larger envelope with her name written across the front in familiar blue handwriting. Grace looked toward Ethan before gently opening it. Inside, she found a folded letter. Her voice trembled softly as she began reading aloud. "My sweet Grace, if you are opening this box, then you have already proven something I always hoped you would remember. You kept your promise. I knew you would. Life will sometimes ask you to wait longer than you want, but never believe waiting means standing still. Every kind person you meet becomes another mile on your journey." Grace paused, wiping away quiet tears before continuing. "One day someone unexpected will sit beside you when I cannot. Do not be afraid to let them become part of your map. Families sometimes grow in ways no road atlas can predict." Ethan quietly looked away for a moment, overwhelmed by the kindness woven into every sentence. Grace reached the final lines and smiled through grateful tears. "When you discover the last adventure, remember this. The greatest destination was never a place. It was always the people willing to travel beside you." Silence filled the old sedan as autumn sunlight streamed gently through the windows. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Words no longer seemed necessary. Grace carefully folded the letter before placing it back inside the envelope. She looked toward Ethan with the same trusting smile she had offered on the rainy afternoon they first met. "I think Dad already knew about you," she whispered. Ethan shook his head gently, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think your father simply believed that kindness always finds its way home." As they carefully returned every treasure to the wooden box, Grace noticed one final item resting beneath the postcards. It was a fresh folded map with only one destination circled in blue ink. No address, no explanation, only two handwritten words beside the circle. "Begin here." Ethan smiled quietly, realizing that even after revealing every secret, Grace's father had still managed to leave them one more journey waiting to be shared together. 1 year later, the first cool morning of autumn returned almost exactly as it had on the day Ethan first walked out of the hospital. Only now, everything felt different. The silver sedan no longer waited alone beneath the maple trees. It rested proudly inside the driveway of a peaceful little home just outside Chicago, its paint freshly polished, its old engine carefully restored, and every treasured memory preserved exactly as Grace's father had hoped. His rehabilitation had continued successfully, and although he still moved more slowly than before, his smile had returned with every passing season. Grace often said that healing happened 1 mile at a time, just like every journey written inside the journal. Ethan smiled whenever he heard those words because they reminded him of the afternoon a frightened little girl had promised to keep a driver's seat warm. On this beautiful Saturday morning, Grace stood beside the familiar sedan, wearing the same bright blue ribbon she had worn the day they first met. She carefully unfolded the final map from the wooden memory box and looked toward Ethan with excited eyes. "Are you ready?" she asked. Ethan laughed warmly. "I think I have been ready since the first rainy afternoon." Grace's father stepped outside carrying a picnic basket while Karen followed behind with a camera, determined to capture the moment everyone had waited so patiently to share. Together they climbed into the silver sedan exactly as they had imagined so many times before. This time the driver's seat belonged once again to Grace's father. Grace sat beside him holding the journal on her lap. Ethan settled comfortably into the back seat, smiling as he realized the little girl's drawing from months earlier had quietly come true. He was no longer standing outside the car. He had become part of the journey. They followed the final map to a peaceful hill overlooking a quiet lake surrounded by tall maple trees whose golden leaves drifted gently across the water. A simple wooden bench rested beneath the largest tree. Attached to its back was a small brass plaque engraved with a familiar sentence. "The best journeys always begin with someone choosing to stay." Grace smiled through happy tears. "Dad built this bench years ago," he explained softly. "He wanted us to finish our last adventure here together." They shared sandwiches, warm apple cider, stories from old road trips, and quiet laughter that echoed across the lake. Before leaving, Grace carefully placed the weathered journal inside the wooden box once more. Then she added one final page written in her own careful handwriting. "Today our last adventure became our first new memory." Ethan read the sentence and gently closed the journal. He realized that nothing inside the box represented an ending anymore. Every postcard, every pressed flower, every photograph, every handwritten note, every folded map, and every promise had quietly become proof that love continued growing whenever people chose kindness over distance and hope over fear. As the afternoon sun settled behind the trees, Grace reached for Ethan's hand exactly as she had done on the day they first discovered the hidden key. "Thank you for stopping that day," she whispered. Ethan looked toward the peaceful lake before answering with quiet gratitude. "I thought I was leaving a hospital. I never realized I was walking into the life I had been missing." They stood together watching the silver sedan glow beneath the golden light of evening, no longer simply an old family car, but a living reminder that the greatest treasures are never hidden inside locked compartments. They are found inside the hearts that choose to keep every promise warm until someone else needs it most.